This short reflection is going to be on Erasmus and his translation of John 1 and 1. Before I do that, I'd just like to mention that Erasmus, 16th century, is probably one of the most interesting reformers of the Reformation period. He walked alongside of Luther as far as he could in terms of Luther's criticisms, theologically, exegetically, politically, of the Roman Catholic Church and what was going on in Rome. And so Erasmus, in many ways, was a decade ahead of Luther, along with Thomas More and John Colet. And so many of the conservatives within the Roman Catholic Sanhedrin at the time thought Erasmus was moving in the direction of Protestantism. And in that sense, he was going to be one that they would have to turn on. So Erasmus had difficulties with the conservatives in the Roman Catholic Church. I'll come back to this in a second when it comes to translations. On the other hand, Erasmus refused at a certain point to follow Luther, and Luther turned on him, called him all sorts of rhetorical names, as only Luther could, in terms of the way he would savage those who would dare to disagree with him. And so Erasmus hiked this very precarious middle road between challenging an entrenched conservatism in the Roman Catholic Church, but also critiquing the Protestant Reformation as it led increasingly more to schism and schism. So Erasmus embodied the notion of being critical, and critical at a pretty substantive level, but also loyal. It's much easier to be loyal and not critical, or critical and not loyal. Living in the tension is obviously the more difficult path to walk. Also, Erasmus, because he was put on the index at Trent, was seen as a Roman Catholic that most Catholics should not read, really up to Vatican II. And then Protestants didn't know what to deal with him because he didn't go the Protestant path. So for centuries, Erasmus has been virtually marginalized, and yet he was seen as the literary primate of Europe in the 16th century. An interesting case of when a person asks the hard questions and lives the hard questions, how you're going to likely be treated by the Sanhedrin on both sides. And the task of, in that sense, as a sage and a prophet, is how do you transcend the culture wars, either religious or secular culture wars of a time, and yet be faithful to the culture, the form of faith that one is a part of. Not an easy road to walk. Often tests the mind, the heart, the imagination, the spirit, pulls the elastic as far as it can, and only the wisest prevent it from breaking in that sense. But to Erasmus and John 1 and 1, Erasmus was primarily a philologist, and he realized, and philology is the study of words or language, and very, very important, because exegesis of the Bible, theology, everything comes from a certain understanding of certainly the biblical sense in the New Testament, what Greek words mean, or in the Hebrew canon or Old Testament, Hebrew words mean, or Aramaic words mean, or what Latin words mean. And so the humble task of the philologist is often foundational to the very work of exegesis itself. And so Erasmus, beginning as a philologist, played a very important role then of how the Bible itself was to be translated, and then the theology, the ecclesiology that falls from all of this. And so there would often be theologians and exegetes would critique Erasmus because he was a philologist, and his argument, if you don't understand what words mean in the Bible, then you're going to come up with all sorts of theological conclusions or exegetical conclusions that distort the very meaning of the text. And in that sense, he anticipates, in the late 19th, 20th century, the study of language and the relationship of language to reality and our experience of reality. But to John 1 and 1, John is probably the most important mystical contemplative theologian in the early church, quite different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John embodies very much a classical understanding of how language is to be used, the role of metaphor, the relationship of metaphor and typology, and for formation itself. And so, but the prologue to John 1:1, begins with, in the English translation often, in the beginning was the Word was with God. The same was in the beginning with God. That comes from, so in the beginning was the Word. In Greek, it's ein arche. I've mentioned in previous reflections that arche probably can be interpreted in more ways than just beginning. We get a word anarchy. Anarchy is those who oppose authority, those who oppose structure, those who are suspicious of authority. When you get an alpha before the word and follows the Greek, it usually negates what follows. And so anarchy has nothing to do with time or beginning. It has to do with authority, structure, order. And those who are anarchists question, they're suspicious of, they doubt, they resist, they turn against authority, and they become their own authorities in that sense. We get our word hierarchy from arche. These are the ones, those in the hierarchy are the ones who increasingly so are the ones who protect elements of whether theology, philosophy, the whole role if you're a president of a university, people who are the top of a medical field or a dental field, legal field. There's a hierarchy, and that has nothing to do with time. It has to do with those who are the guardians and protecting the best of what something stands for. And so when we hear the word einarche, it's not about in beginning, it's about the ground, the guardian of all things. That comes from the Greek, the archons, who protected the variety of Greek the polis, whether it's Athens or Sparta or the many other Greek city-states. So in the beginning was the word, which is logos. Now the word logos, again, is one of these very complex Greek words. You get the pre-Socratics use it in a way, Heraclitus and others, in its way. It's about the presencing of that which is, and what it means is for the philosophers, how are they to be open, how are they to be present to the presencing of that which is present. So it was not for the pre-Socratic philosophers logos. It wasn't a series of ideas that we play chess games with, analyzing thoughts and ideas, and whose idea emerges as the most logical, the most thoughtful, the most convincing. And so it was more about the presence of that which is, and what it means as human to be open to the presencing of that which is present. And so, but logos has often been translated, as I mentioned earlier, with in the beginning was the word, as the rational principle. And various forms of Christianity is seen as one very much of pandering to the word, and to thinking, to abstract thinking, to organized thought, to getting your ideas right at the level of confessions and creeds. But it's very much a cognitive, it's interpreted as a cognitive word. And in that sense, the word logos has been trimmed, it's been pruned, it's been shrunken, it's been cabined, it's been cribbed, it's been confined, to use Shakespeare, to a limited understanding of what logos means in that sense. It has a much more expansive, dynamic meaning in classical, pre-Socratic, and Greek thought itself, in which myth and narrative and storytelling are very, very important in terms of embodying the great visions of which logos is meant to lead one into wisdom and then to love at the very highest element itself, and the dynamic of the presencing of that which is. So Erasmus, obviously coming out of the Christian West, as questions were being asked about the Vulgate, and some people will argue it's Jerome's Vulgate, but Erasmus and many others argued that the Vulgate itself was not only Jerome's writing, because many of the conclusions that were articulated in the Vulgate ran contrary to Jerome's translation at the time. And so Erasmus was part of a group that was articulating very clearly that the Roman Catholic Vulgate, which for the conservatives in the Roman Catholic Church was viewed as the inspired, inerrant, infallible almost word of God for the Catholic Church. Erasmus began to question, and he gratefully so had access to many of the most significant Greek texts of the Bible. He knew his Latin. in a way that very few did, and he had also studied Hebrew at the time. And so one of the issues that Erasmus was engaged in at the time was the Vulgate had translated word as verbum, and verbum tends to mean in Latin an abstract principle, an idea. The scholastics were very interested, obviously, in the verbum, the notion of ideas that can be debated, that the scholastics, the Scotists, the Occamites could debate. And this is logos when translated into verbum, meant essentially the debate, the discussion, the dialogue over ideas. So then Christianity essentially shrinks to the level of getting ideas right. Who understands best the nature of God? How can that be articulated in an abstract, theological, or how do you exegete a text so everyone gets the ideas precisely? And this is when logos is translated into the Greek as verbum. This is what it becomes. Erasmus was part of the group of thinkers, and in this point he was breaking all sorts of ground in what he was doing. He said the Latin fathers of the West did not translate the dynamic of logos, or the presencing of that which is, as an intellectual discussion. The word that was used in the Latin West by the fathers was the word sermo, which we get our word sermon from. And anyone who sits within either a lecture at a university or homilies in parish in the Divine Liturgy knows that the teacher is very much engaged and alive. And if they're a good teacher, you can sense their heart and their mind very much reaching out to people who are sitting within the sanctuary, and people are responding to the aliveness of the teacher, and they call forth from people what they might be, what they could be. They evoke. And in that sense, that's what logos is, and what Erasmus was getting at in John 1:1 is that just as logos means the presencing of that which is present, the divine coming to us, calling out of us what we might be, what we could be, if we are but attentive and listen and are willing to change. So sermo is the best translation in Latin for logos, because it's about, once more, the dynamic of God in Christ via the Spirit coming to us and calling us out into our new life, our deified being. And so when Erasmus chose to translate logos, and he argued the equivalence would be sermo, not verbum, that speaks to the heart, the mind, the imagination, through stories, but it's the presence of the teacher calling forth the deeper presence of what others might be. And that's what a good sermon does, and that's what the logos is meant to be. So the logos is just not a rational principle that people can engage in, and as I mentioned earlier, played a chess game with ideas and who's got it right and who's in, who's out, based on how you cross your T's and dot your I's. But it's about the encounter between, in terms of sermo, between the teacher, who's meant to embody the dynamic of the logos, and those knit together with the teacher or the preacher giving the homily or the sermon. This was how the Western fathers interpreted logos, was through sermo. And as I mentioned, Erasmus faced immense opposition from the Roman Catholic Sanhedrin at the time, who were very Thomists, in which getting ideas logically right, articulating them, defending them, but where is the presence? Where's the life? Where's the dynamic? Where's the encounter? Where's the I, thou in all of that for people? So Erasmus very much bucked how logos was translated. He tried to recover what it really meant for the Latin, and as a result of that, it was part of his turn to the patristics of the West in arguing that logos, when translated into Latin, equals sermo, and then what does that in fact mean for the formation of the imagination, the soul, the encounter between people and people, as the communion of the saints, and between God and humans. And so this is where we come back to the notion of philology. If we don't understand what words mean, or if we shrink a more dynamic word, a word that means encounter, to an abstract argument, we then in many ways sanitize what the Bible was trying to get at. in terms of its dynamic and its encounter tendencies. And Erasmus is very much committed to this notion of encounter, and in the Buberian sense, the I, thou. And so philology is very important, or the study of language, because the implications, if we don't understand language or the deeper meanings or complex meanings of language or layered meanings of language, we can get the Bible, or we can make the Bible say something it really doesn't say at all. And out of there you get the Sanhedrinism, the Phariseeism of Christianity, and a whole variety in which various tribes fragment on what verses, what chapters, what books actually mean, and they actually miss the very spirit of the truth in fighting over a variety of abstract letters of interpretation.